Thank you so much, Claire. Great, so this is the political economy panel, and our 4 papers are, well, first, as Claire said, because of a slight reshuffling of the order, we're gonna start with 2 papers on Peru. So one by María Balarin, that paper falls within the RISE political economy of adoption work. Then the second complementary Peru paper is from Barbara Bruns from our intellectual leadership team, co-authored with, as Claire just said, Jaime Saavedra, as well as Schneider. And then third, we have a paper from Masooda Bano from the political economy of implementation work on locally rooted support for Islamic and Quranic schools in Nigeria. And finally, Levy will be joining us online to present a synthesis across all of the 12 studies in the RISE political economy of adoption work. So political economy, as we all know, is a big, messy area of lots of unresolved questions. I notionally majored in political economy in undergrad, but don't remember enough of the definition. So for this framing, I'm gonna just focus on politics in a very common sense way, rather than trying to pick a definition among the many. I'm also just gonna discuss 2 really broad questions and try to situate the papers within them. It is 9 a.m. Friday morning, and for some of us, it's the 4th of 5 wonderful but very tiring days. So yes, very basic question. So first, whose politics? And of course, when we think about politics, often we think first about those who hold formal political power or have very well-established mobilized interest groups. And these are more of the focus in the 2 Peru papers, which explore the dynamics of reform over a similar period of education reform. María Balarin, who will be dialing in from Lima at a crazy hour, will first be giving us a broader picture of sort of the political discontinuities and institutional weaknesses that the reforms face there. And then Barbara will be zooming in a little bit more on specific teacher-related policies and the nitty-gritty of implementation of them and the politics behind them. Both of these papers use elite interviews. Maria's also has extensive document analysis. Barbara's paper also has her and Ben's really wide experience in the comparative politics of education in Latin America, along with, of course, Jaime's front row seat or driver's seat during his time as minister. But when we think about the question of whose politics, beyond sort of these big players and politically visible people, as we've been hearing the last few days, or those who have been here throughout the week, like, local communities matter, parents' voices matter, and this comes out eminently clear in Masooda's paper, which is an ethnographic study in northern Nigeria. And you'll just see there how really local communities and mobilization and groups stepped in when state weakness disappointed people's aspirations. And then, of course, still related to this question of whose politics, Brian will come in at the end looking at many things, but among others, different configurations of political players more broadly. So among the many distinctions he looks at is, one is whether politics in a given setting is dominated by a particular group or competitive. And if it's competitive, is it personalized competitive or impersonal competitive? I'm not gonna try to gloss those, my brain is a bit tired. So we'll just move on to the next very broad question, and the politics of what? And in terms of what, because this is RISE, you will not be surprised to hear that one of the 3 things we think about in the politics of what is the politics of schooling, right? And the phrase we've heard multiple times, isomorphic mimicry, where schooling is often a way of just symbolically showing that I am a member of the club of modern bureaucratic states. And states use this to prove their bureaucratic state legitimacy, whether to the global community or to their own citizens. And of course, whether or not learning whether it happens within the delivery of school buildings and kids in seats and things like that. Of course, sadly, another thing we need to face for people who were at some of the internal meetings, you also heard about how, with the example of Indonesia, because schooling involves infrastructure and procurement and employment, it can be subject to corruption. That is a sad reality, and predatory elites sometimes step in, as our colleagues from the Indonesia paper showed us. But besides that politics of schooling, there's also politics of learning, and Lant has written many times about how the politics of learning are more difficult than the politics of schooling because learning is complex and there aren't straightforward technical solutions that will necessarily get you from A to B. So you do need to iterate. And also because the full benefits of educating someone are realized over a lifetime rather than over electoral cycles. So politics of learning. And then, of course, there's also politics of socialization. And socialization is a legitimate and valuable and multifaceted aspect of education. But again, in politics, it can be vulnerable to use in social control. So we've done politics of schooling, politics of learning, politics of socialization. The last thing I wanted to say is that sometimes we talk about these separately, but of course there are overlaps and complementarities between them, like schooling and socialization. I think earlier in RISE, before my time, Agustina Paglayan presented a number of times very persuasively about how schooling often expands as a means of not in response to mass democratization, but as a means of authoritarian or autocratic leaders, or colonial ones from my part of the world, trying to exert social control over populations, because that can throw up the legitimacy of your regime, blah, blah. Schooling and learning, blah, blah, not disrespect to her, blah, blah is my Friday 9 a.m. brain. Schooling and learning, although they can be competitive, as we've seen across lots of RISE research, schooling and learning are, of course, complementary, and schooling is, of course, one of the most efficient vehicles for systematically delivering learning at scale to large numbers of people. And we'll hear about that and the messiness of how these coexist during periods of transition, and I think a lot in the Peru papers from María and Barbara, and degrees in which the transition from politics of schooling to politics of learning, how progress and lack of progress in some areas happen there. Finally, socialization and learning. So I think also we're often used to hearing about how one of this can come at the expense of the other, but they also can be very complementary. One of my favorite factoids is that Finland had basically universal adult literacy like more than a century before they had even like universal lower secondary education. And that is because to get married in the Lutheran Church in Finland, you had to be able to read and write, both men and women. So socialization and learning go together. And that is also something that we'll see very much in Masooda's work on mobilizing community support for the sorts of education that people want their children to have. So that was a lot already. Friday morning, I'm running out of steam, so I'm just going to trust Brian to tie all the threads together as our fourth paper. But first, to start off, we have María Balarin from Peru. María, are you online? Can you hear us?
Yes, I can hear you.
Wonderful. The floor is yours. You have 15. Oh, sorry. I forgot. I'm so sorry. 2 housekeeping things. One is I do plan on being very strict on timing for this panel, partly because it's the first one, partly because I really hope the panelists will talk to each other in the Q&A and not just the audience, because I think there are lots of complementarities. So I will be giving a warning around 5 minutes and a verbal cue at 1 minute. And when you hit 0 minutes, I will allow you one final sentence. The second thing is I encourage people, especially if you're online, to submit questions throughout. I also especially encourage questions that speak across the papers if possible. So on that note, the floor really is yours now, María. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, everyone who is following the session. I'm very sorry that I couldn't join in person due to the current state of air travel and COVID restrictions, but I'm here at 3 in the morning in Peru time, very awake, I hope. What I'm presenting today is the result of the political economy of education reform study conducted under the auspices of the RISE program. And this study was very interesting for me because it led me to revisit a number of themes that have been very close to my mind and my work for over 2 decades through my research into policy implementation and reform. And I find that there is a tension, almost a contradiction at the heart of this work that I continue to grapple with and which might become obvious in this panel, and which has to do with how we tell the story of the past 2 or 3 decades of quality and learning-oriented reforms in Peru, and how the period can be narrated in quite different ways. One story could be one of success at introducing and sustaining important reforms over time and achieving notable improvement in standardized tests and other indicators. But there is also a B-side to this story, one of things left undone or not carried forward, of marked discontinuities in education policies, and the political economy dynamics that lies behind this. It is a story of how things get done or not in countries with weak states and institutions. And while this story is the one that I'm focusing on today, I still grapple with that contradiction and wonder whether it's an expression of my own biased and pessimistic intellect, of my localized perspective, or of the things that I pay attention to as a qualitative researcher, often visiting schools and talking to teachers and students. And I also wonder, finally, whether these 2 narratives can be brought together somehow. So just a little bit about the study. Its aim was to understand the political dynamics behind the establishment and development of the learning policy agenda in Peru between the years of 1995 and 2020. So when was the learning agenda established was one of the questions, how it was sustained over time, how the agenda has been understood, and how different policy priorities have been defined, and how has the movement towards key aims taken place, how have those aims changed over time, and what has the role of different political actors been in shaping, supporting, and contesting this agenda. There's a specific focus on curriculum, teaching, and assessment, but really a broader focus on reform intentions and framings. It's a qualitative study based on interviews and documentary analysis, and you can see details of that in the paper itself, which should be available. The RISE studies started from the political economy studies, started from an idea of trying to understand reforms through the lens of political settlements and how they shape different countries' commitment to certain courses of action and the institutional arrangements that they give rise to. And trying to also look at the role of different stakeholders, institutional parties, and individuals in shaping reform agendas. But I also had a more kind of personal concern, which has to do with the political economy of education reform in weak states. So what do I mean by this? While in the global South, certainly formal institutions are not uniformly weak, there are vast differences in the enforcement and stability of rules that make settlements themselves and binding agreements possible. Some political scientists suggest that institutions and rules, rather than being treated as a taken for granted variable, should be taken as a variable for analysis, okay? And here I remembered Guillermo O'Donnell's idea that he spoke about the unrule of law in Latin America. And I think we could extend that to talk about the unrule of rules. So a question that lingers behind the work is how to understand the political economy of learning reforms in such an unstable context with weak states and institutions. So just to give you a bit of context about Peru, during this time, Peru could be described as having a broad, informal neoliberal regime with a focus on macroeconomic stability, primary export-led growth, and its particularity is that it's been extremely averse to regulation, redistribution and state spending, and institutional reform. Institutional weakness from the lack of a civil service career, a weak judiciary, and etc., limits the formation of binding agreements, settlements, and the formation of policy agendas in education and beyond. A local historian says that we live in a kind of colloidal republic in which the state is like an emulsion that never reaches solidity, a country in a state of constant but moderate anarchy, a state of disorder that is only controlled at times. So how has education policy evolved during this time? What I'm showing here is like a timeline of the different presidential regimes that we've had during this period that I characterize in these terms. I mean, from 1995 to 2016, we've had like 5 presidential periods. A first one with President Fujimori that I describe as a period of forced stability, then a period of high instability, then a period of more or less 2 governments of relative stability, and then what has come afterward, after 2016, which is a period of extreme instability. We've had 20 education ministers in 25 years, 23 in 26 if we continue to 2022, 6 presidents charged with corruption, 1 under life imprisonment, 1 awaiting extradition, 1 who took his own life as prosecutors entered his home to arrest him, 1 under house arrest, and 2 facing trial under restricted liberties, plus the current president under investigation, all for corruption scandals. So this has certainly had an impact on the education policy agenda. What we find in terms of the main policy orientations in education during this time is that in the 1990s, in the context of an authoritarian and corrupt regime that was implementing structural adjustment reforms and where there was a strong influence of international agencies in the definition of policy agendas, not only in education, we see the beginning of the formation of a proto-technocracy in the education sector and surely in other sectors too, and the clear beginning of the learning policy agenda, with a strong emphasis on transforming classroom practice, a policy focus on remedial teacher training, curriculum reform, infrastructure, and assessment. In the period between 2000 and 2006, we have a return to democracy after authoritarianism, and a marked break with the policies of the prior period. And a focus on mostly governance reforms, like decentralizations, participatory decision-making, and an awareness of the need for teacher career reform, but with very little advancement, and evidence of a strong crisis in learning through PISA results. But in terms of the policy agenda, this was a weak period of learning policies. In the period that started in 2006, we have a learning agenda re-established, and the renewed presence of international agencies, and the shift towards an understanding of learning as test results, and what can be described as a partial teacher career reform. This is followed by a period of what can be seen as comprehensive reforms, a move towards a meritocratic teaching career, governance, curriculum reform, and an emphasis on pedagogic practice as well as test results. It's a period of large-scale programs to bring about pedagogic change and curriculum implementation. But from 2016 until today, what we see is a period of extreme instability. We've had 5 presidents during this period, from 2016 to today, and it's extreme instability and the progressive dismantling of reforms through the influence of external dynamics, not specific to education, that have to do with corruption, etc., and the influence of specific interests, teachers' unions, conservative parents, private education investors. It's been a period with many positive outcomes, a marked improvement in progression indicators, enrollments in secondary and early years, a marked improvement in national and international test results since more or less 2006 in the context of enrollment expansion and coinciding with economic growth, but starting also from a very low point. Learning is certainly now at the center of reforms and educators' minds. We have up to now a meritocratic teaching career, a consolidated national curriculum, but as I said, they're being withered. And learning has been an established learning assessment system that serves to align policies towards a clear goal.
Maria, 5
but
minutes.
Okay,
5 minutes.
we also have concerning results, which is a persistence and a deepening of inequalities, especially socioeconomic segregation, which has markedly deepened during this period. A persistence of high learning poverty, and what could be described as a poor classroom practice with a narrow and shallow curriculum, poor opportunities for complex and critical thinking, for reflection, for interaction, and what some researchers, including myself, describe as a situation of deep epistemic injustice. We also find what researchers describe as a hollowing out of curriculum content through ill-defined and implemented notions of competencies and learner-centered pedagogies, a partial teacher reform where meritocracy has been established at the level of the teaching career, but there hasn't been a consistent or pre or in-service training reform, and so there's problems there in terms of moving teachers in this meritocratic career. And I think one other problematic result is this reductionist equation of learning with test results that seems to work against a focus on important changes in school practice. So in terms of the political economy, we see that reforms have followed a very discontinuous path. Agendas are established at one point, abandoned, later taken on again, but in a different form, patched together, often losing important elements. More than political contestation, they have been affected by broader political instability, institutional weakness, and increasingly corruption that is not specific to education reforms. There has been a positive movement from a highly idiosyncratic and personalistic model of policymaking, where individual ministers and officials redefine politics and priorities at whim, to a more technocratic and rationalistic model of policymaking. Reforms have been, to a large extent, sustained through the action of technocrats and with much influence, aid, support from external actors, not only international agencies, but also local researchers and think tanks, and have been tied together through programmatic instruments such as results-based budgeting. But although this has brought positive changes, it has also led to a kind of reductionist technocratic settlement around the idea of learning and quality as simply equivalent to improved test results in a couple of curricular areas. We also find that technocracies often speak to themselves, but they can be dismissive of other views and interests, those of education specialists and teachers demanding more coherent pre and in-service training, for instance, or other costly programs to bring about change, which have not been implemented. They often pay little attention to the political settlements that may be necessary for long-lasting reforms, like the views and interests of teachers. And what we find now with in this period of dismantling of reforms that we are in now is that the golden era of technocratic policymaking seems to have ended at a very clear point in 2020 when Congress managed to oust Education Minister Jaime Saavedra, and starting the progressive dismantling of teaching reforms, curriculum, and other policies. Progress has been made in what can be described as first-order reforms oriented to improving service delivery, but not necessarily in second-order reforms, seeking more profound changes in pedagogics, in pedagogic school practice and organization, in what Hossein and Hiki describe as the craft involved in the interpersonal activity of teaching and learning. I think I'm done with time. I have a final slide, but I can leave it there. Going forward, I find difficult this question always. I think we need to understand reforms or link reforms to broader and more fundamental institutional reforms to help them. So not just thinking about education reforms per se, but linking them to those broader reforms, like in the civil service or in the judiciary or other areas that could help sustain them. We also need to strengthen our strategies for generating binding agreements and settlements in such weak and unstable contexts like Peru, through public debate, communication, and more openness to existing institutions like, I don't know, the National Council for Education, for instance. But this politics has been somewhat dismissed by the leading technocrats at some point more than others. And the final point is really going beyond the need to go beyond simple reductionist technocratic conceptions of learning as results, which might miss the pedagogical core of educational practice. So how do we bring results together with what actually happens in schools and classrooms?
Thank you so much, Maria. Your time management, I don't know how you manage the perfect time management at 3 a.m., but you have set the bar very high. Barbara, it's your turn.
Thank you, Maria. You set the bar very high in many respects because your paper is brilliant and your comprehensive view of Peruvian education policy over the last 20 years. Is this the right clicker? Yes. Are my slides going to come up?
Just give them a minute. They're coming up.
Okay, thank you. Really puts what I'm going to talk about in perspective. The idea for this paper came up about 4 years ago when I presented Ben's and my work on Ecuador at a conference at the World Bank, and Jaime said, why don't we do something like that on Peru? So at that point, I could have predicted that it would take 3 years to finish a paper together because of his schedule. But I could not have possibly predicted COVID and the election of Pedro Castillo. So I think Maria's, sweeping long-term perspective really gives a good context for what I wanted to try to do, what Ben and I and Jaime set out to do, which is to try to link the experience of Peru into what we've been talking about in the RISE program in a couple of respects. First, I think one of our three facts is that transforming education is possible. So I think we need to talk about how complex and messy the process usually is and how long it takes. Second, when we talk about purpose, it's easy for us sitting in a conference room to talk about the importance of government having a purpose of focusing on learning and raising learning outcomes. But purpose in the real world is the messy political process of trying to build a significantly a sufficiently powerful group, alliance of common interests around a set of policy directions, and even more difficult sustaining that over time. Okay, so I want to go through what's happened in Peru, talking about the last decade. How did it happen, implementation challenges, and the political process behind those results. If we're talking about countries that have seen major improvements in learning, Peru is really a model example. It's the only country in LAC to continue raising PISA performance over 2015 to 2018. And so over a decade, one more year of content mastery in secondary school students. I just want to call attention to this because Maria cited the learning poverty estimate for Peru, but that's based on the 2013 CERCE regional study results. So I think the estimate today is lower. I don't think the World Bank has updated it yet, but there's been tremendous gains in all domains and at the 3rd grade and 6th grade level since 2013. And all of this has happened at the same time as enrollment has continued to expand, particularly in preschool, but also primary and secondary, lower repetition and dropout, higher completion rates, and steady gains on the early grades, which have been the focus of a lot of attention in the Peru's education policy, starting with a census-based assessment of children's literacy progress in 2nd grade in the 2000s. And the urban, rural, and rich-poor achievement gaps are certainly important, but they have been shrinking. So how did it happen? Over 10 years of major system reforms and complementary reforms. In Peru, like many countries, long-term progress in education, I really believe, depends on reforms of the teacher career to make it a meritocracy, where teachers can expect to be rewarded in line with their performance, and truly low performers can be dismissed from service. So the first effort in that was the 2007 Carrera Pública Magisterial, which was introduced the 3 key concepts of teacher hiring based on performance evaluations, teacher selection and promotion based on evaluations, and regular performance evaluations of teachers in service, basically taking away their universal inalienable right to a job in perpetuity and saying that they will be evaluated and can possibly be fired. As in Colombia, Ecuador, and Colombia and Ecuador, which also had similar reforms, it ended up being very difficult to extend that to all teachers off the bat. So there was a political bargain struck that it would only apply to newly hired teachers. So then there was this problem of managing two streams of the teaching force, some which had the old rights, and some which would be subject to the new evaluation standards. So in 2012, there was a major legislation passed to extend the teacher career path reform to all teachers. 2014, a higher education reform, creating a first higher education oversight agency, curriculum reform, and then a reform to expand the oversight of pre-service, of tertiary institutions, including pre-service teacher training. So there is a clear pivot to learning. And I think Maria even put in a longer context. Since the 90s and 2000s, there's been clearly learning at the center on the education agenda. And there's also been a lot of progress in data management and measurement. Just as an example, this is from recent work by Chris Nielsen, which draws on the administrative capacity to identify where teachers are placed and link that to their scores on the teacher evaluation entrance exam. And as Jaime wrote, without sound measurement, there would have been no real understanding of the magnitude of the problems, and nor would it have been possible to use that data to mobilize parents, the executive, and public opinion. There's also been more funding. Spending as a share on education as a share of GDP went up significantly over this period, and complementary programs, full-day schooling, teacher mentoring, high-quality learning materials, including scripted guides for teachers, expanded ECD coverage, a rural student teacher incentives program, which has been rigorously evaluated and found to have real impact in the rural areas, school bonus program, meritocratic selection of school directors. So everything was being transformed. Some of the major implementation challenges, when we first started talking about this paper in 2018, I thought, okay, 9, 10 years after the reforms of 2012, we'll see like 20 or 30% of the teaching force, refreshed by newly hired teachers coming through stricter hiring standards, and start to see some impact on what's going on in the schools. But the decision by the ministry to have a very high standard on the teacher entrance exam, which in fact has been validated in some sense by research by the IDB, showing that in fact the teachers who score highest on the exams are adding value, have higher value added between 2nd and 4th grade in the schools that they subsequently teach in, shows that it is it's not easy to develop a teacher hiring exam which is effective, really is a decent screen for teacher quality, but in Peru seems to have done it. But the downside is only typically the highest share of teachers who've taken the test that have passed it ever is about 13%. So as of today, it's been much slower progress in actually getting change in the teaching force. And if you contrast that with Ecuador, which had an early retirement program, which allowed 25% of teachers to be changed in 4 years, and Washington, D.C., which immediately put in place a teacher evaluation process, which changed 30% of the teaching force in a few years, you can see that that's a much slower process in changing, actually getting the newer, younger, higher, better prepared teachers into the classroom. Also, slow progress in raising the quality of pre-service education. The reason so many teachers can't pass the test is that they've had very weak academic preparation. And part of the slow process is that the ministry's attempts to put oversight and accreditation restrictions on these sectors has been rebuffed by political forces in the sector, the private providers that have diploma mills, that run diploma mills. Ecuador and Chile have both made much more progress in closing low-quality tertiary teacher training, and Chile has, in 2016, did a major reform to actually say no one can go to teacher training unless they're in the top half of the academic distribution to start with. So those things are making a big difference.
About 5.5 minutes.
Okay, good. So just to step back a second, from what we see across countries, teacher quality reform is inherently conflictual because you're imposing costs on teachers and their teachers' unions. Unions have the political power to derail reforms in many places. And this new force in many countries in Latin America is a political alliance of low-cost providers in teacher pre-service education. One thing we have to recognize, though, is that teacher quality can also threaten, reforms can also threaten government interests. Very often, they take away the patronage politics opportunities for, governors, mayors, district supervisors. And so education is really particularly prone to clientelism. And these quality reforms introduce transparency and reduce political discretion. So you're asking politicians, and we see this in the Indonesia case, you're asking politicians to trade off direct power and political support for uncertain public approval from the results of their reforms. On the allies, some of the people who most stand to benefit, like parents, are often dispersed and not a strong organized force in support of reforms. Business communities rarely drive the reform process either. As Maria said, education policy networks, NGOs, think tanks, and multilateral organizations can also be a supportive force, but they can rarely have the political power to drive it. So you're forcing politicians to face costs and lose support from groups that might give them money. In fact, Jaime, one of the things Jaime said was that Pedro Pablo Kaczynski, who had been supported by the private sector, private school providers, when was considered to have turned on them when he allowed Jaime to proceed with the higher education reform. So the question of what motivates reform, you know, I haven't seen a case where there's not some, as Marilee Grindle, his famous book says, some reform monger, some actor that is prepared to start launching the process and pushing for the reforms. External pressure, the PISA shock was a factor in most of the ministers we talked to used PISA results as a justification for the reforms. And the reform supporters in Peru had a number of, reform dynamics in Peru had a number of supporters. Alan Garcia was very articulate. Kuczynski, who took the unprecedented move of asking Jaime to stay across from one political administration to another. Strong support from media and public opinion. And, you know, there's some debate about this, but a relatively weak union, SUTEP, and a relative absence of clientelism compared to, say, countries like Mexico or Indonesia. So the core political strategies, the central bargain is higher salary increases in exchange for more selective hiring and loss of job stability and the fact that you would be evaluated in service. Grandfathering of the reform, as I said, higher incentives when they, and then strategies that Jaime particularly used very effectively was communicating directly with teachers without the union, sending them all direct text messages, constant outreach to the media, and bundling these structural reforms that have big costs and long-term benefits with more visible short-term supports and programs. Infrastructure, longer day schools, teacher mentoring. I would disagree a little bit with Maria because I think that thinking about the process of teaching and learning in the classroom has really been a part of the Peru's programmatic efforts. The union has fought these with strikes. In 2017, they actually organized quite disruptive strikes. And the Castillo presidency is really compromising the implementation. 3 ministers in 1 year, the leak of the first leak ever of the teacher entrance exam. So the conclusion, I'll do this one. System reforms of teacher policy are really, I think, an essential condition in most countries, something to change the way they recruit, groom, and motivate better teachers and in order to improve teaching and learning. And in Peru cases were possible because of the technocratic champions, the relatively weak union, relatively weak political parties, less entrenched clientelism, and consistent public support. Increased spending, strong learning measurement, and data contributed to complementary programs and policies. But the high standards combined with low progress in raising the quality of pre-service education has really slowed the process of renewing the teaching force, leading to a large share of teachers remaining on short-term contracts and some political frustration. And political upheaval in messy multi-party environment and the education battleground created by these new political forces, the private higher education providers and religious groups who have mobilized against the curriculum reforms around sexual and gender issues have really created exogenous threats to reform continuity. So last picture.
Last sentence.
Reformist ministers can win public support. When Jaime Saavedra was being censured by the Congress in a really purely political maneuver, there was the first marches I've ever seen in the streets in support of the minister.
Thank you, Barbara. That was a very long last sentence, but a wonderful presentation. And now over to Masooda.
Yeah, sorry.
Sorry for cutting you off. No, you keep it.
So this paper that I'm going to present is coming out of the political economy of implementation work done under RISE. So it's one of the RISE studies. And for those who are just here for the first time for this conference, just to explain the political economy element, the implementation element is looking for reforms bottom up. So district level kind of reforms or directly at the efforts the communities can make to support learning and schooling in these countries. So the paper, there are 2 papers we do in Nigeria. Each country, like PETI element, it's the short for political economy of implementation, looked at 4 countries, different questions. I won't go into them. But in Nigeria, we looked at 2 questions. One is the bigger question about donor support for school-based management committees, and the evidence that we get from Nigeria, especially most of this work is done in the state of Kano in northern Nigeria, a Muslim majority state, very densely populated, the largest sort of population-wise northern Nigerian states. And so 2 papers are done there. One looked at the SBMCs, and we found not much evidence of support for community to participate in SBMCs. But it's also very interesting context where if you want to look at organic modes of community participation for supporting learning and schooling, it has a very rich history. So methodologically, the approach I adopted in Nigeria was that we are seeing a formal-led system of what in the literature might be called induced participation, these SBMCs, which are failing to win community support despite donor and state efforts. While on the other hand, there's a very rich organic network of Islamic and Quranic schools. I'll show you the photo first to get your mind into it. Actually, my mind seems a bit slow at 9 this morning session. So. Apologies if I sort of sound a bit slow. But yeah, so there's a very rich network of Islamic and Quranic schooling in northern Nigeria in general, in the state of Kano. And this is all community-supported schools. I'll explain the types of schools. I need to get a bit into it for you to understand the argument. Because it's that kind of an argument which I think verbally is I find it slightly difficult to present. Let's see if I'm coherent about it. Because it's a very fine kind of argument on moral values, communities valuing sort of moral and ethical values, and how do we deal with that in education. But I hope if you get interested, read the paper, because I think it's an argument that one can be more articulate about when you write it to make it more convincing. But anyway, to go back to it, so there's a huge network of Islamic and Quranic schools in northern Nigeria. Just to give you an example, actually, to be honest, this study is done in the rice, but I got involved with this network in 2008 because DFID was trying to work in northern Nigeria in schooling, and the quality standards and even access is very low in that region. So what they realized was that there were like 6,000 total of Islam, like primary and secondary state schools, but there were close to, according to a local state survey, close to 23,000 Islamic and Quranic schools. The photos of the kind of schools I showed you later, I'll explain, they're of different types. So the idea was that, because I work on Islamic and Quranic education at higher levels normally, not the basic level, but anyway, they found, they searched for me, and they were searching for advice. I got involved for 8 years with these, trying to sort of introduce modern subjects into these schools. So I know these schools very well, but we did this particular paper under rice. And the origin of these schools goes back to 14th century, when Islamic Empire was established in northern Nigeria, and there were very sort of high standards of learning. People used to come to this region actually for learning reasons. And when I say Islamic learning, pre-colonial Islamic learning was never just about reading Arabic or Quran, which contemporary one is. It was like you were being trained for the statecraft, for economy, for everything. All kind of knowledge was in these institutions. But after sort of British indirect route comes in, even in northern Nigeria, starting like 1800s, these schools are marginalized because British established the modern schools, which is the case across the Muslim countries which went under colonial rule. Same thing happened, that the Islamic Quranic system was marginalized, mainly apart from a lot of other things that the state took away the money, which before the state used to give to these schools. Now it went to the modern schools, like the British established schools or the French established schools. But also another thing happened, which was this, that their degrees were no longer recognized by the state. They never had formal written certificates, but they had a way of recognizing when a student had graduated or completed education. So that was sort of not recognized by the state anymore for any kind of employment. So these schools are entirely displaced. So that's like this historically is important to understand. So they were very important pre-colonial, in the colonial period, they were marginalized. But the interesting bit, what you have to remember, and that's relevant for us, is that they never disappeared. Despite state withdrawing their support, they remain the largest provider of some kind of education in northern Nigeria. But even in other Muslim countries, whether it's Pakistan, Bangladesh, Muslim communities in India, these Islamic and Quranic schools remain very dominant. Maybe not as big in number in ratios, but they're there. So the question is, and they all rely primarily on community support. That support can come in form of donations. It can come in forms of teachers teaching a bit voluntarily, from community members teaching voluntarily, or giving land for the school, or helping build, construct it. And also different types of community participation takes place. And since we're interested in community participation, that's why we're trying to understand how do they mobilize it. So here, there are different types. That's briefly important to understand again, because this is called, what I have on the left is called a Sanghaya school. It's a boarding school. It's remains for the male students historically. And you can see even the way the students are sitting and all, it's not a modern school. It's a boarding school. They sit outside, they read the Quran and all of that. On the other side, you have Islamia school, which are more modern kind of schools. They again rely on community support, teach primarily Islamic and Quranic subjects, but they also teach modern subjects. By modern subjects, I mean state curriculum. And as a result, some of the bigger Islamia schools can give degrees which are recognized by the state, like secondary school degrees they can give, because some of the Islamia schools can go all the way to secondary. And that, again, is interesting for the argument I'm trying to build, is important to understand, because according to another study that I've done under the DFID time in Kano, I did a study on what are the most popular schools in the community. And it's a popular school not just because I think it's like a person thinks it's a good school, but it's because it's the top-ranking school where people want to get their children in. And they were actually the biggest form of Islamia school, not the state schools. Private schools in Kano are still very small in northern Nigeria, like really elite private schools are few in number. So they were actually the Islamia schools the top 10 that came out to be that popular. They give a balance of Islamic and Quranic, and modern education, and that was very popular. So now to get to the heart of the question, why do we find community supporting them? So at one level, the argument is again very simple, and you might say then what do we really learn from it? And that's the kind of assumption a lot of the state officials I used to have when I initially went there, and even the donors got me engaged, but the starting assumption about why this school exists and who supports them were a bit simplistic. So of course, the first impulse could be, they're religious, so people support it purely for religious reasons, which of course at one level could be true. One is not denying that a bit of that religious motivation just to support that school could exist. But the reality is actually much more complex. If we want to learn from it, like why do they have participation and these state schools are failing, is this that what we have to appreciate is that communities might actually have much more complex notion of what education should be than what the modern state has come to believe. Because if you look at the World Bank even reports, the latest one, like the Education Rising 2018 one is the latest, in which the learning crisis they discuss very explicitly. In this paper, I give you quotes. Of course, they recognize that the report starts with it's not just about economic empowerment through education. It's about creating this morally, confident citizen who's responsible, who's socially responsible. They say all of that. But in practice, they move then very quickly, that is recognized, but move very quickly into this education and formal employment, or education and lower fertility. The very tangible, these kind of economic or material outcomes. But in these kind of communities, what you find, and you remember this at Kano, although this work happens across the rural and urban districts, northern Nigeria up north, if anybody has been up in sub-Saharan Africa, I haven't traveled too much, so I cannot compare, but it's like very low economic development. So even the urban regions are more like, I can compare for South Asia, where I originally come from, like what urban Kano is a bit like rural Pakistan. Do you understand? So even the urban is very economically low developed. So you have to understand that context to understand how choices are being made about what to support and what not to support in terms of education. So the expectations are very complex, and because especially you find this, and this is evidence coming out even out of our Indonesia paper, which is economically a different context, a much economically developed context, but in the rural area, a rural district, a very high preference for Islamic or moral education, let's put it this way, alongside the modern education. So, the argument being that parents actually, when you talk to them, when you have a lot, or you're spending time in the community, there's a lot of sort of emphasis on education. Yes, we need education for employment, but we need education also for building a morally responsible citizen who respects the tradition and who is more, who upholds the moral conduct. Now, that is, I'm going to show you in the next slide, that's where the debate gets very complicated, because what they think of morality can be very different what the modern school, along with the modern state and the development agencies, think of moral behavior, whether it's on gender, whether it's on other issues, on respect to authority, the approaches start differing a lot. So how do you settle those tensions? But anyway, so I should rush. But the Sanghaya school, For the Sanghaya school, I have to say that, so apart from the moral value element, you have to also remember that when I say communities have complex reasonings for what they choose, Sanghaya school, when you find at one level, they just memorize Quran. But at another level, when you spend time with them, it's a 7-year cycle as a minimum. And what you find is that by living with the Malam, Malam is the Quranic teacher, they learn a lot about how to fend for themselves. Because it's a rural area, so like they learn how to sort of do a bit of agriculture. So as an adult, unlike the modern school where they'll graduate and unless they have formal employment, they'll have nothing. These children learn how to survive and have a married life afterwards, just by relying on local resources. Islamic school, on the other hand, like I said, if they're the good ones, they're the big ones, they give that balance that the community wants because they give you Islamic education and modern education, so morally responsible, religiously sort of educated and individual graduate who also has done well in modern subjects and can now go and get formal employment. The state school, on the other hand, actually creates a basis of moral crisis. That's one of the arguments one is building, because at one level, it is completely failing in its main promise, which is that we'll give you formal education, and you can then go ahead and have formal employment, which the community really wants. Nobody, even in this religious, so-called morally driven kind of community, nobody wants to live in very low economic standards. So they are all very actively looking for formal education. But the problem is that your schooling system is failing to deliver education that can lead to that formal sector employment. Also, bear in mind, it's an economy where there are not many formal sector jobs available anyway. So what you end up doing is you end up creating a young generation which has done metric, secondary education. Some might even go on to higher education, but there are just no jobs. And their aspirations are now, because of the schooling system, the state schooling system, that all they can appreciate is a formal sector employment. So the fact that now there's no job, so all it leads to is frustration. Like I give you examples of boys on motorbikes in Kano. The first time I went there in Kano, one of the first things explained to me by my development local counterparts who were in the DFID office that, oh, you see these boys going around on the bikes all the time. They're all graduates of schools, but they refuse to do any jobs because they only want formal sector jobs. So for them, modernity is go on a bike, dress in Western clothes, although it's in fact a borrowed bike, but not work, because they want to show they're modern, they're educated. And they become very unproductive members. These boys become a concern for the society because they do nothing else but waste time like this. So the problem, just I have 2 minutes, is to the issue then becomes is that for the community, these state schools are the worst of package. Do you understand? At one level, they are not giving you living up to the promise of giving you formal employment. At the other end, they are creating aspirations which are unreachable, creating a frustrated youth, and at the same time, a morally bankrupt youth in their view, because these youth become very disrespectful to their parents. That's another concern that keeps coming out. While the Islamic and Quranic school, on the other hand, produce a very respectful, you respect parents. Even if they're wrong, unlike the Western culture, you cannot question them. You cannot call 199 or whatever if your parents beat you. No. It's a respect of a very absolute kind for authority, especially for parental authority in the Muslim cultural tradition. So do you understand? So in that kind of way, I think there's something very sophisticated one has to understand at the fine theory level somewhere, that in communities, I repeatedly find where the formal institutions are weak, the informal remain important, and they remain important not for ideological reasons purely. They're Muslim, fine. Partly because they're efficient in that system. Do you understand? Because economy is not allowing you to move out, to have these independent, they're not just those kind of jobs. People have to live together. So then respect for parents or for your ties and all becomes important. Otherwise, you'll be fighting all the time. That's what the young boys end up doing. So do you understand that there's often an optimality or efficiency argument, I would say, to the community choices, which we as outsiders often ignore, when you go in for interventions, because you think, oh, they're just doing it for religious reasons or they're just backward. But finally, all of these issues, if you start taking them seriously, raise very problematic questions. What I'm problematic, I'm saying, and I'll leave you with these, they're not easy to answer because one thing is that who decides then what kind of moral values should go in the curriculum? Communities, state, or development agencies? Because just to give you one controversial example, gender is very obvious one. Respect for parents, I've told you another one, or authority in general. But early marriage is one example. Because donors, I think, have a very active part in modern state schools. What kind of messages are going out? So there's a very, in northern Nigeria, in sub-Saharan Africa, you see literature where donors very actively promote girls should study in the school, the messages are coming, and they should not, and early marriages are discouraged and all of that. While in these contexts, my own argument work would show that, and Watkins, our own Barbara Watkins, that's the name, right? Susan Watkins, sorry. Her paper in Malawi argues very similar, that in these kind of contexts, early marriage is, in fact, at times a more optimal option, not like 12 years old, but 16, around 16 and all. So all I'm saying is that these are very contentious, is how do you decide? And secondly, also the whole idea that what the West thinks is moral, or the development agency, like LGBT rights, in that society has no space. So who decides it should go in the curriculum? We should have tolerance for it. So all I'm saying is it's very, these answers are not easy, I think, in these questions.
Masooda, last sentence.
I finished.
Masooda, I think your slow is everyone else's like hyper-caffeinated aspiration.
I think it's the 5th day, and I'm juggling another workshop since yesterday as well. So I thought I was slow.
No, you're great. Well, it's 4 or 5 a.m. for Brian Levy, who's coming on next. So Brian, I don't know how caffeinated you are, but it's your time now.
Great, thank you, everybody. The other screen is still on. We need to change the screen. We need to remove, oh, there we go. Now I can do this, good. Thanks, everybody. It's a pleasure to be participating. I have an enormous amount to cover. This is 12 country studies plus a framework, so I have to go very fast to give you a flavor of the approach. I will talk about the framework. I will provide a framework for thinking about countries, and we will talk about entry points. So the place I want to begin is with a causal chain. This is the causal chain that links context, politics and power, institutions, country and sectoral, entry points and learning outcomes. The entry points for improving learning outcomes need to be responsive to these contexts, and context cascades. Politics, back end of this context, it shapes the country institutions. Politics and the country institutions shape sectoral institutions, and both the country and the sectoral institutions set boundaries on what reforms are feasible. So what we're going to do, the 12 RISE country studies, I'm going to spend some time characterizing education systems and characterizing the country context within which these systems are embedded, and then ask what all of this means in terms of entry points for change. So the place I'm going to begin for characterizing education systems comes directly from the 2018 World Development Report. Are the systems coherent? No, some yes. And if they are coherent, are they aligned to learning? And this gives us 3 distinct patterns which provide the basis for what's going to come. So the first is what I call the learning sweet spot, the space where you have a good enough coherence and a good enough alignment of learning to achieve strong developmental gains. Just to give you a sense of this, with good enough coherence and good enough alignment, then the specific technical interventions, of which there's been a great deal of research, can add substantial value. But the problem is that country contexts can constrain getting to the sweet spots. Systems can be coherent, but they can be coherent around goals other than learning, raises the question why. Systems can be fragmented. So this is what we need to come to grips with in terms of trying to think of ways forward. And here's a striking conclusion, which has emerged for me out of the reflection from all of these cases. And it's this: for education systems that are outside the sweet spots, there are limits to the sort of classic institutional incentive and sector-specific technical interventions. That's the bad news. The good news, across all non-sweet spot systems, and indeed, in fact, to sustain the sweet spot, there is a surprisingly large role for soft governance initiatives, which I'm going to call ideas and norms. So give you a flavor of that as we go. Second step is, having defined education contexts, we then need to think about country contexts. There's been a huge amount of work in trying to think, what's a simple parsimonious way of distinguishing amongst context? Can't go into it in detail, but what I'm going to do, and this is distilled from multiple years around this, is organize this work and the presentation around 3 heuristic contexts. Is the system dominant? Is the system competitive? And if it's competitive, are the rules of the game personalized or impersonal? Turns out to be strikingly straightforward as a first approximation to categorize countries. Simply use the set of the VDEM indicators and end up with a distribution and a result, which is both intuitive and, I like to think, useful. So let me begin with the dominant context as a place to start. So dominant contexts, top-down governance of institutions. This top-down governance produces maybe personalized but generally coherent bureaucracies. But the question that arises is coherence in relation to what purpose? And the answer that comes through very, very powerfully when one looks across the political economy studies in the dominant countries is that what shapes this are the ideas of the top leaders. So here, just to give you a flavor of it, not going to go through each of these, but the studies are compelling. Different political purposes drive the goals of the system across these different contexts. Amongst them, the only one which one would argue had a broad-based commitment, not just to universal access, but to learning orientation amongst the set was Vietnam. But the fact that in these dominant settings, it's top-down, and that it's the ideas of leaders that drive the way forward produces a pretty clear conclusion. If you're seeking to improve learning outcomes in these dominant contexts, the place to enter is to engage the political leadership around the purposes of the system. And you're going to see this for each of the 3 areas. Key entry point in these stuck places that are dominant is ideas. Now, let me move on and let's look at the competitive contexts. So all of these competitive contexts, for reasons everybody here is familiar with, is a tremendous allure of expanding access. In teasing out how these function, the distinction between personalized and impersonal rules of the game turns out to be fundamental. So that's how I'm going to build this going forward. And let me start with the impersonal context, for which the RISE studies, there are at the national level 3 countries that fit this. So in these impersonal contexts, goals, as in the personal goals, are set politically, and those goals are set by navigating multiple stakeholders and multiple interests. The political bureaucratic interface in these impersonal competitive contexts is governed by rules, a classic so-called Weberian bureaucracy. Formally, the political bureaucratic relationship is arm's length. There's a hazard in these, that what ends up being compliant around rules as almost an end in itself. And there's an underlying issue here of control versus discretion. So just to give you a sense of how does this translate into the education system, it translates into the process compliance trap. That the hazard that you get coherence anchored in rules, but the coherence is aligned more around process compliance than around learning outcomes. So what do we learn about this through the 3 country case studies? So the country case study in South Africa offers a vivid illustration of how a process compliance and isomorphic mimicry can deeply undermine the best intentions. The country case study of Peru, as we've heard, describes richly what a chaotic political bureaucratic interface, how that might function. When you look at these country studies through this lens, it's Chile that from the 1990s on seemingly gets its Weberianism right, where, as per the quote here, elite consensus is established, technical experts' capacities are reflected in legislation that goes through smoothly, and legislators don't add much because they're not expert in the field. That's a quote from the Chile case study. But there's a puzzle. We saw the data in the previous presentations. If we contrast Chile and Peru, we see that it's Peru that is the country that is showing the relatively rapid gains. And so the question is why? And I think one answer emerges from what we know about the governance of large organizations. Governance of large organizations involves a tension between control versus discretion. That how do you navigate this tension? This is from Francis Fukuyama, rich literature. Good managers know you navigate this tension through the informal norms and the group identities that most strongly motivate, cultivating the culture mattering more than fixing the formal lines of authority. And in this, the contrast between Chile and Peru is a striking one, because as you see, taking a quote from the Chilean study, the good intentions in Chile were not enough to move the Chilean education system in the direction wanted. By contrast, in chaotic Peru, civil society organizations are much part of this messy melange. And while they may not be able to contain technocrats or policymakers, they certainly contributed to the continuity of agendas and to the advancement, though piecemeal, of reforms. Which brings me to this as a conclusion, once again, ideas in
Brian,
relation...
5 minutes.
Once again, ideas in relation to the impersonal competitive setting. That autonomy and a sense of shared purpose is won politically, not simply conferred hierarchically. And brilliant work by Daniel Carpenter on how that's actually built. But the key point here is that it's not the incentives, the formal institutions and the technical capability that win the space. It's the soft governance, the legitimacy and the shared norms, ideas that are key. Third context, do it quickly, personalized competition, very, very messy context, a context in which fragmented bureaucracies are unavoidable. Or to put it in the framework of education systems, these are systems that are fragmented, and by definition in the fragmentation, not aligned as a system towards learning, and they are stuck there, because that's the content, that's the framing of the country system. So what is to be done? I think two things to be done. The first one is within this messiness, there can be scope for the emergence of islands or pockets of effectiveness. I've done some work around this at the school level in the context of South Africa. From the Hickey and Hussein book, there's a quote here. The Ghana case study offers a very interesting example of this local level island of effectiveness. Second entry point in fragmented systems, I think the inspiration for me from this was Kenya, which is this remarkable overperformer with active citizens, and this insight from Ben Piper, who many of you will be familiar with, but many, many years in Kenya, that it's in a sense, look at the head teachers are held accountable for results to the extent of being paraded around the community if they did well, or literally banned from school and kicked out of the community if they did badly. It's the idea of all for education that is what is mobilizing and creating this outperformance. And so, to conclude, 3 broad conclusions. First, the political and institutional preconditions for getting to the learning-aligned sweet spot are demanding. Second, it's not helpful to imagine an institutional leapfrog. In trying to ask what is the way forward, one wants to ask which of, and I have used these 3 heuristic contexts, which I think take us quite far, which context is the one when which one is working? And within that context, what are the possible entry points for making gains? And then thirdly, and I was surprised by how strongly this came through across all 3 contexts, for these non-sweet spot systems, it's the soft governance initiatives, engaging political leadership on goal setting, building education sector stakeholder coalitions, that's a broad definition of the education sector stakeholder around a shared purpose, strengthening norms within organizations, fostering an all-for learning vision. It is these soft initiatives that take one into the sweet spot, which is where many of the high-powered, high-quality technical interventions can come into their own. So that's what I take from the comparison. Thank you.
Brian, you actually ended with a minute and a half to go. So I think now we just need to start having all our conferences at 3 and 4 in the morning because Maria and you are fabulous. And I will try to give you back a bit of that time during Q&A. Do we have Benro Schneider online, Barbara's colleague?
Yes.
Okay, so I think, again, in the interest of livening things up on Friday morning, what I'm going to try to do is do a round of questions. That is one from the room, one from our colleagues in Abuja. We're going to try them live first. If we can't get their audio, then my colleague Rusty will read the question instead, and then one question from online. So if you have a question in the room, please raise your hand. If your question is only for one paper, please put your hand down. If your question is for all 4 papers, please wave your hand frantically. Okay, let's go to, and please project.
Moisan Sarver from ODI, currently working on education in Nigeria. I'm going to try and formulate this to sort of fit across all papers, but some of the presentations yesterday were very much about, RCT and country X, and, but the title, as someone pointed out, one of the chairs pointed out, it's just country X. Don't say it's all going from countries, right? The whole sort of what we're trying to look at is systems of education. We keep coming back to this idea of a political entrepreneur or a pocket of effectiveness that works, right? So to me, those are two things that seem quite different in terms of what does it mean to scale? Has anyone ever seen scale when it comes from a pocket of effectiveness, when it comes from, a political entrepreneur who's left the system? So I think just some reflections, both from Peru, from Brian's own work, about what does it mean, what does it look like? Is it possible to think about scaling, to think about sustainability after the life of a political champion or a political entrepreneur? Just some reflections, not a big question.
And thank you for tying together threads from yesterday and today. So we're going to try our colleagues in Abuja now. I saw them a minute ago.
Okay, if I speak, will it get there?
Yeah, I'll ask them.
Yes, I just have a question for the presenter about Islamic schools in the northern Nigeria. So I wanted to ask, something captured my attention where it said that the schools are delivering what they said they will deliver. So, and in my head, thinking about the disaggregated data for learning trajectories in Nigeria, I'm well aware that the northern areas are lagging behind compared to other areas. So I wanted if you could throw more light on how you came up with the idea that the schools are delivering what they said they would deliver. So that's the question.
Okay. We're gonna take one question on, no online questions. Okay, that's good because Lant wants to exert his research director privilege and has something you want to say before we go to the authors.
First time I've asked a question. I think one of the things that emerges from Masooda and together with the classification of Brian is that Margaret Mead has this famous old saying that the universal purpose of modern education is to turn the child of a peasant into a clerk. And I think both Brian's discussion of fragmented contexts and Masooda's discussion is that in many contexts, that role of the modern schooling is failing in two ways. One, they're not actually providing the children with the skills they would actually need to be a clerk. And second, there are no jobs as clerks anymore. And so the very legitimacy of modern schooling is under threat. So one of the Pet A papers that Brian didn't mention about KP province in Pakistan has exactly this same flavor, is local authorities are saying, and then if we think of Brian's context of moving towards Weberianism, it's like the local authorities are completely rejecting that they need to be more Weberian, that they need to be more ordered, more rules-based, more meritocratic hiring, because it's like the state schooling premise has been doubly illegitimated. You're not preparing kids for futures they don't really have possibilities of anyway.
Great, excellent. We're actually gonna go, oh, sorry, we'll take another, I'll take another round of questions. Oh, are you gonna build on? Okay.
Yeah, there. We'll take a next round.
Okay.
Oh, come on. Well, sorry.
Okay, so we're gonna go to Ben first to reward him for waking up early for Q&A. Then I think we'll go to Masooda because there are a number of questions related specifically to her. Then to Brian to reward him for finishing early. And then Maria, then Barbara. Is that all right? Thank you. So Ben, all yours.
Okay, in fact, I'm in Munich, so I don't have such a challenge. I wanted to raise a couple of things, and in this context of thinking about champions and reform mongers, because I think they're important, but I think they're particularly effective where they meet less resistance. And I think this is crucial to the Peru story in comparison to other reformers like Chile, Ecuador, Colombia, and Mexico. And the key thing is that the major opponents of reforms in those cases, teacher unions and clientelist politicians, were much weaker in Peru than in the other cases. So you take the teacher union, SUTEP in Peru. First of all, it organizes less than half of all teachers who are members. Public opinion has a fairly dim view of the union. Half disapprove of it. Since the 2000s, it's been subject to a number of kind of fracturing and dissident movements. So it's organizationally weak in that sense. And the government along this period sort of pulled away certain supports that it was giving to the union, like automatic dues checkoff and paying some union members to be full-time organizers and so forth. So it was all throughout this process, SUTEP was weakening and less able to mount opposition. The second main actor that can attack these reforms are the clientelist politicians, who of course want to get into the education system to be able to appoint supporters as teachers, as school directors, and so forth. This usually requires strong parties to develop this kind of system. This is another way that Peru is distinctive in the weakness of its parties. On indices of party institutionalization in Latin America, it usually comes out close to the bottom in terms of how strong the parties are. And of course, they're famously now fragmented and fluid. And possibly most important is that the turnover in the legislature is very high. So legislators come in and out, and they just don't have time to put together a sort of clientelist strategy using education appointments to a long-term political career. So that's also very weak sort of possible opposition. And what this means is that technocracy or reform mongering has a greater chance of succeeding. And Peru, again, in comparison, throughout the past 2 decades has had a higher share of technocrats understood just in the sense of not having political careers, higher share of technocrats in the education ministry than any other country.
Ben, I'm gonna have to cut you off there. Thank you so much.
No.
Yes, and Masooda, can I ask you to be quick? So either Lance's question or the
I can
question.
take that too,
okay,
quickly.
Wonderful.
The thing is that it's good you read the bullet in the slide. What is meant to say was that a primary role for Islamic and Quranic schools, especially the Sanghaya, a lot of the number are the Sanghaya, the boys' school photo I showed you. They just do Quran and moral education, and they deliver on moral education. Do you understand? So they deliver what they promise to deliver. That's what I meant. Not high learning outcomes, but those Quranic schools don't even promise learning outcomes of that kind. Islamia integrated do. And if you're looking at data, you will find a very interesting. I'll give you something to look at across the district. Look at the government data for the primary and secondary school, and you'll find the best performing schools are the Islamia primary, which are the integrated ones adopted by like state takes over, recognize them at a certain level, rather than the state schools. So those ones which promise both do deliver both. So that's why I say they deliver what they do, while the state ones, Lance summarized it brilliantly again, that they don't deliver what they promise to deliver, which is quality education that can give formal employment, partly because the quality is so bad and partly because formal employment is just not there in most of these contexts to that level.
Great. Thank you, Masooda. So Brian, any thoughts from you on any of those questions?
Yeah, so let me make 3 points. First one, in response to this dilemma, first in response to the dilemma that a pocket of effectiveness is just a pocket. The question that one would ask is, are there ways of, quote, wholesaling support for pockets of effectiveness? I take the example of South Africa, where I worked. South Africa has in place a well-articulated set of formal systems that empower school governing bodies. The research shows that sometimes they get captured, sometimes they're effective. The evidence also shows that interventions to support school governing bodies, say, for example, by NGOs, are also sometimes effective and sometimes less so. But what has been absent in that South African's narrative has been any systematic ongoing effort to support the governance at that school of those bodies. That would be a wholesale way of leveraging pockets. So that's point number one. Point number two, the issue of, well, champions versus resistance. Is this a matter that the places where champions thrive are places where resistance is strong? Let me offer, not inconsistent with that, but complementary to that. Let me offer the possibility that cultivating champions is something that comes uncomfortably to the sector specialists, technocrats, that this cultivation of coalitions, I meant to say, sorry, the cultivation of coalitions is messy. It involves working with and engaging with groups and others with whom one might disagree, who may even on the surface seem like they have opposing issues and interests. There's a fascinating example, again, in the South Africa case, how the South Africa won the space to put in place a set of learning assessments. But the absence of a sense of the importance of a learning-oriented coalition meant that in that case, the bitter fighting over what was the right way to designing a learning assessment among the technocrats completely enabled and undermined any capacity to build out broad-based support. So my question that I would ask, and actually this is part of how I read that Peru study, is it's almost as if in Peru, in the midst of all the messiness, the art, the craft of cultivating coalitions, even if it means we have to let go of some of our favorite technocratic views and some of our favorite views of who our friends and who our enemies are, is a part of how one wins and builds space. And then third, and once again—
for your third point.
Yeah, this is my last. Once again, the pockets of effectiveness, if we look at what it is in Kenya that might account for these outcomes, it's the idea of all for learning. It's not this system or this detail or that detail. It's a matter of creating a sense of space and possibility and culture that is oriented towards learning. So 3 variations on my core theme. It's the soft stuff that matters. Thank you.
Thank you, Brian. Now to Maria.
Yes, hi. Okay, so I'm going to talk to both kind of Ben, Barbara, and the question about scalability. I think we can agree on a few things. Yes, opposition to reforms, political opposition to reforms has for a long time been quite weak. The unions are weak. Technocrats have had a great scope to do things. But when we look at the longer term, I think, if you consider what has happened after 2016, that raises a lot of questions about that story, about the scope that technocrats have had. Because what we see after 2016 is, okay, in Congress, we might not have direct clienteles, or maybe we do, but we have direct representation of very specific interests. And teacher reforms, I was looking at a list of norms that have been approved in the past few years. And the teacher reform is being like microscopically withered over a number of norms that Congress has been passing. Teachers are reacting against a reform that has introduced evaluations and has raised the bar for them, but that hasn't really delivered on the training and support. It did at one point. During Jaime's period, there was a magnificent program, I think, that actually addressed the issue of scalability. So they did have the possibility of addressing scalability by providing like whole school interventions to raise and improve pedagogic practice. But that was progressively stopped, partly because of technocratic and efficiency considerations. It was expensive and they were not really willing to put so much money into that. And then just because of so many changes so technocrats are not resistant to those institutional weaknesses that mean that one minister after another might come into office and say, we're going to do a completely different thing. They can hold on the fort only for so long. And if you have those changes, like coming one after the other, like we've had since 2016, then what they can hold on to is very little. And they may come back 2 years later and find that everything has been wiped out and they have to start again, but they don't have the time. And so I think that the islands of efficiency and this idea that technocrats have so much scope to think and imagine, I think technocrats need to do a bit more politics and really put themselves in the shoes of teachers, for instance. I mean, in my experience, and many of these technocrats are my friends, but they don't really talk to teachers so much. And so understanding that other perspective is important. But also these broader political and institutional issues are really important to take into consideration because they do affect what technocrats can do.
Thanks, Maria. I'm going to have to cut you off there. And Barbara, with apologies, I think we're going to take the last question, then you can have the last word of the panel on whatever you want. I saw frantic waves here. Was it a question from Emmerich or was it an online question or both?
It was from Nigeria.
Oh, okay, there's, wait, Emmerich, did you also have a question? No. Okay. Abuja, so you can ask the last question, but can you do it in 2 sentences, please? You're still on mute, so we can't hear you yet, but we'd love to hear from you if we can.
My question is for Barbara. I want to know if we concentrate only on meritocracy for teacher recruitment, what about teachers that have the motivation and the high personal values? Can there be like a balance so we can have those, because some people might do well cognitively in tests, but they cannot impart knowledge to the students. So what kind of results will we have if we only concentrate on cognitive assessment for teacher recruitment?
Thank you very much.
Great question. I would say never concentrate only on cognitive skills, but the evidence does seem to support that you need at least a threshold level of cognitive content mastery to be a truly effective teacher. And there's also, it's interesting, the Peru selection process actually was a 2-stage process that had the first stage, the academics test, and the second stage was a decentralized interview process at the level of the regional delegacy and an observation of the person actually practice teaching. So I think there has to be a comprehensive evaluation. And also there has to be support to teachers, because even if they're very, smart, and all of the global evidence seems to be that smart teachers, having smart teachers is important. There's papers by Eric Hanishek and others about this, and very interesting research by Chris Nielsen in Chile, finding a very strong correlation between the teachers who scored most highly on the onto the university entrance exams and their subsequent value-added performance as teachers. But I think it was never the idea in Peru that that's all you do, that you also want to work with teachers, you also want to give them coaching support, and I think a lot of the progress that Peru has made has been finding new ways to get teachers to work together, to be coached more effectively, and to be supported with better materials. But I think it just is not directly an answer to the question, but I think it would be good to have a discussion about these different paradigms of whether educational change And sustainable educational change can come from pilot interventions being taken to scale, or, as I believe, some system-wide reforms necessary to get the overall incentives for teacher and the selection process for who gets into your teaching force and how they're rewarded for performance and how they're held accountable for poor performance.
You mind about Jaime?
Just before we bring Barbara, could you just briefly say something about Jaime's 15 minutes later in the day?
So I think it wasn't possible to have Minister Saavedra as part of this session. It's a little early where he is, but he has offered to have a 15-minute discussion, taking open questions from people at the last 15 minutes of our lunch hour. So coming back here at 1:15 before the second afternoon session, before the first afternoon session starts, we could have an opportunity to speak directly to someone who's been on the front lines of the reforms we've been studying.
Great. Thank you very much. And so just before we break, my unsatisfyingly vague 3 key takeaways are: one, that the long haul matters. You really need to be there for the slog. Well, a whole range of actors need to be there for the slog, which is related to the second vague key takeaway. Communities and coalitions really matter. I think this is very obvious across the papers. And the third key takeaway is ideas matter. And again, that sounds unsatisfyingly vague, but if you are in this room, I'm going to assume you care about education, partly because you want children to access the wonderful world of ideas that you can access to. So on that note, thank you so much to Barbara, Masooda, Ben, Brian, Maria.